When I was a kid, one of the first things outside the classroom to really get me into history and imagining the past was Age of Empires 2. To this day, certain voice lines are burned into my brain, chief among them being Jaguar Warrior of Tenochtitlan. There was something both about the history and the stories of the game and the way the lines were said, with emphasis and tone, that made it remarkably compelling. I'm sure many people have many different lines burned into their head, but that one's mine. Another game in the same series managed to burn some lines into my head too, but they weren't storylines and they weren't in my native language. Age of Mythology is a related but different beast from Age of Empires. It is, as the title suggests, a game about mythology rather than history. It attempts to stick to accurate mythological elements, but it's not depicting a version of real-world events, rather a meeting of 3 to 4 cultures that weren't ever really all in the same place at once. For whatever reason, the barks from Age of Mythology's Egyptian units got stuck in my head.
Iurifer. Ak, Io-ir, Iurifer.
Ayurifer, Anwit, Antiu, Inagirek. But hey, here's a question. What languages are they even speaking in Age of Mythology? What are any of the units actually saying? Given the tradition of the series, it might seem really obvious. They're the Greek, Norse, and Egyptian factions, so probably whatever languages those historical people spoke, right? Well, kind of. Ancient Greek and Old Norse are languages that aren't natively spoken anymore, but are recognized and understood, studied and taught, in a way that makes them no longer living and no longer alive, but still accessible. It helps that they're intelligible to some degree to their linguistic descendants. The Egyptian languages are in another situation, and that's what got this train of thought to board at the station. What words have been rattling in my head? What is Ayurifer? Because here's the thing, Ancient Egyptian is a dead language. We don't know what Ancient Egyptian sounded like in full. We're largely missing vowels, so what did they use? Well, according to the wiki, it's... oh. So that's it then, right? It's just the product of some early internet scouring and edits to make it sound less goofy, not remotely authentic, or based in anything traceable. Well, I'll certainly concede that the thing that got me interested ultimately isn't that interesting, but we're here now and there's a lot of questions and things to think about. I recognize and appreciate going the extra mile for authenticity, but I'm also well aware there's a diminishing returns here, and as we'll see, some touches are harder to be authentic on than others. First, the question has to be asked if the games are rigorous with their use of language, if there's an attempt to be authentic. To which the answer is, as sometimes is the case on this channel more broadly, this is a game first, history second. Or, in this case, mythology second, but the languages are historical. By which I mean, no, these aren't perfect deployments of language for the sake of accuracy, they're impressions for the sake of immersion. That's not a knock against the game, but it bears noting and will come back up. Let's return to the Greeks and Norse, because they're a bit easier to cover and will help establish a baseline. No, I'm not getting into the Atlantean thing. Short version, the Atlanteans speak a mix, like different words from each faction, which is a choice. A website that's probably more than 20 years old hosts that as an answer on the FAQ for the game. At the very least, it's cool to know that people besides me have been thinking about language in these games for a while now. The Greeks speak Greek. So that's a good start. Now, is it ancient? Yes and no. The words are ancient Greek variants, but the accent, so to speak, is modern. That's pretty straightforward. The Norse don't have a singular successor, but they are in a similar boat. Or should I say, similar longship, haha.
Skipan?
Já. Ég vil satt.
I asked some Nordics to help me with questions about intelligibility and pronunciation, and it's definitely serviceable and they're speaking a real language. Beyond that, I asked for Ludo history to look into the pronunciation from an academic lens, and there's some issues there, foremost being that it's very modern. Issues arise in that while intelligible to some extent to modern Nordic languages and related to Icelandic more directly, the pronunciation isn't ever going to be perfect. Even Iceland, isolated as it was, is not a perfect time capsule for language. And this isn't an invitation for a bunch of guys with palette swaps of the same flag to knock down my door saying, "Hi, sorry, but I don't think you are correct about which Nordic country is what. I don't mean to sound rude, but I think it's pretty clear that we pronounce things more better here." One thing to note with the Norse, and by extension all factions, but it's most easily visible here, is time compression and how that impacts things. When is Age of Mythology is a bit of a silly question because it's basically a fantasy game, but it is worth noting that it takes its elements from a wide span of time. This is because the factions are a mix of mythological and pop cultural expectations. Sorry that every time I have ever brought up an audience expectation for a video game quasi-historical faction, it's been about quote-unquote Vikings. Point being, comparing the span of when the Old Norse were kicking around through to the proliferation of hill forts is a long span of time, and in turn that means the language won't ever be perfect. We're spanning centuries with this depiction, after all. One funny thing here is that, going back to the Age of Empires days, I had friends from Norway who played this game a bunch and they could understand the Viking faction. Except for one bark. In their collective hearing, it didn't come out right, so it became the mysterious ontologi. Tangential though it is, the anecdote does highlight that these languages are intelligible if you know what they're saying. Usually. They're not just mumbling something in a gesture towards sounding like a language, they're speaking a language, or whatever living relative they can get their hands on. Which brings us to the Egyptians. Now, Egyptian stands out from the trio. There is not as comfortable a direct descendant language. The closest we have is Coptic, but as we'll see, that's not exactly an accessible option. As for speaking the ancient version directly, well, we aren't sure how pronunciation worked yet, and only certain reconstructions are far enough along to be usable, and I don't think anyone would call them authentic at this stage. But video game devs aren't going to wait around for the academic community to have a more totalizing grasp on Egyptian phonetics in order to make a game, you know? Inagirek is no more real than Loktar Ogar from Warcraft. The slightly longer version of what I said before about not having the vowels is that we don't know and can, at best, speculate via things like Coptic what the vowels were, bearing in mind that the time between ancient Egyptian and today's Coptic is longer than the existence of all forms of English. So the vowels have probably shifted anyway. There's also some trouble with consonants and emphasis. If you're now wondering how we have any words at all, like the names of gods and units in the game and stuff, well, at this point it's more like a uniformalized academic pronunciation that is well aware it isn't correct to history, but serves contemporary communicability. Hey, wait, if we don't know vowels, then what about the guy who's kinda a big deal and like half vowels, Osiris? Great question. That's a version of his name which we get from Greek. Wesir is what we have now in written Egyptian form, which people voice in a fair few ways. Since we lack the vowels, for all we know it could have been Wuser or Wasar, provided the phonetic conventions are followed. For more on all this, I recommend this video/playlist by Armchair Egyptology, which goes more into depth than I have space for here. You can also find a video on the Rosetta Stone there, but for the briefest of summaries of why the stone mattered and what it did, it, with the help of the then local Coptic population, were able to give archaeologists insight into the translation of hieroglyphics and thus even start the process of understanding Egyptian. The Coptic element was integral to grasping vocalization, but there's some details we'll come back to on that. As for the game and its pronunciation, my initial suspicion was that there would be a situation paralleling the Rosetta Stone here, that developers would look to Coptic as a bridge or indeed a good enough substitution, a gesture towards authenticity. So naturally I asked fellow YouTuber and Egyptian Copt Enrel if, plainly, the words seemed Coptic. They said, not really, but it's also certainly not Arabic. Beyond that, I thought I would look into the actual concentration of speakers and the functionality of that speaking. While Coptic is classified as an extinct language in the present, and indeed has been declared as such for quite some time, the declaration is premature. While largely contained to ecclesiastical aka religious use, there have been efforts to teach the language and a very small group of people use it as a household language in the present. I'll link some resources that explore that, though suffice to say the language isn't exactly accessible or studied in the way Latin is. For our purposes, this is relevant, as Enrel suggested, in that an American game studio probably wasn't going to bother with or have access to speakers if my hypothesis even were correct. So we're still left wondering what the words are. Another layer of difficulty in terms of authenticity is that Coptic itself forked over an effort to shift towards Greek pronunciation in the 19th century, so once again, Greek gets in the way. I reached out to Greg Street to no avail, so all we have to go off is the relic remnant of a tweet that itself is gone but alluded to on a wiki. The information as is dangling by a thread over the precipice of being lost to time. But also it's a game first, getting to the bottom of things has vastly diminished returns in light of the tweet. And the point is that it's not authentic Egyptian, but it also never could be. Another thing to note, just like with the Norse, there's some time compression going on in this Egyptian depiction. It might be less apparent to someone who hasn't studied ancient and classical Egypt or given a pop understanding. What I mean is that ancient Egypt is a massive span of time, cue the Cleopatra and the Pyramids fun fact. And there are elements of the Egypt faction borrowed from Egyptian myth into the Ptolemaic era, and that's going to be very relevant for language in ways that the comparatively concise inspiration for the Norse and well-documented inspiration for the Greeks isn't. With this baseline, a case study for the deployment of language, let's broaden out a bit and talk about how historical settings use language. And when I say broaden out, I mean both in the sense of what games we're looking at, and in that we won't be looking at games immersed in just one setting. Assassin's Creed and games like it are an interesting lens, but for today we'll stick to historical strategy. Civilization, of course, has language in it as well, and it's arguably actively trying to be more historical and, to a degree, educational even. It's easy to put onto Civ all the questions I had for Age of Mythology, and indeed the whole Age of series. Looking again to Egypt, Civ 5 Ramses speaks Egyptian Arabic.
تحياتي أنا رمسيس الإله إنني تجسيد حي لمصر أب وأم جميع الحضارات.
Civ 6 Ramses, a recent edition I haven't bothered to buy, speaks reconstructed ancient Egyptian, which might be more like Middle Egyptian. Cleopatra in 6 speaks Middle Egyptian, which Middle Egyptian in her lifetime would barely exist outside of religious function. There's a lot more to it than that, but the short version is that it's rather odd for them to depict her, 1, speaking a language that would be more effort to replicate in the game when Koine Greek would be viable, and 2, would mean speaking a language that predates her by a few hundred to few thousand years. Ramses II and Cleopatra are about 1,300 years apart. My most generous interpretation of this comes back to the old games first, history second thing. Picking for her to speak a game-wise, unique language adds flavor to Egypt, and Middle Egyptian is the most well-constructed, so there's that too. It's really that simple, but we're getting ahead of ourselves in discussing that now. There's a fun contrast we can do here with the deployment of accents in these games. Units may speak their proper language as a tactic of immersion into a faction, but leaders are meant to be intelligible, and that's where we get to accents. They didn't have the Napoleon voice actor in Age of Empires 3 speak French or just use a default English voice. No, he had to sound, for lack of a better term, Frenchy.
Can't train your own soldiers, so you recruit them from the wilderness?
This is less of a thing in Age of Mythology. Arkantos doesn't speak with a modern nor ancient Greek accent.
Proseche?
Lege, lege.
Léger. Perhaps setting out on this errand really was all that was needed to appease Poseidon.
Overall, the questions all lead us to another. Why? Now that we've gone over the idea of accuracy and authenticity, it's almost time to look at intent. As stated before, language in these games isn't meant to be the most flawless representation. So, what's left to mention? Well, audience. Audience informs intent a substantial amount when talking about languages. Who made this game? Who for? If my experience with deranged Russians who play 20-year-old strategy games is anything to go by, these games from American studios like Civ and the Age of games do have international reach. While translation isn't something I have the ability to get into right now, it is worth noting that these games, when translated, adopt whole new signifiers of language and culture. But at the core, these games were made, at least in these examples, by Americans for an Anglophone audience first and foremost. That's where the locus of language lies. Again, Napoleon sounding Frenchy. Language is a powerful tool for evoking an otherness, an otherworldliness. There's a lot of flavor imparted in the intelligibility and unintelligibility of language. The shift between intelligible, i.e. accents, and unintelligible, i.e. units in Age of and leaders in Civ, is one made depending on the intent. In a sense, the accent moments are a compromise for the sake of gameplay. Accents allow for intelligibility while maintaining the marks of a language. This takes two forms, one being just flavor alone, presuming Napoleon really is speaking English, but that's what he sounds like. The alternative is that, diegetically, Napoleon is probably speaking French, but we magically understand him. Here's a small tangent that wraps back around. Religious music sounds dorky in English to me rather than obtuse and magical. That's why Gregorian chants are cool and Creed is Creed. It's why I wish I could unhear the English of Handel's Messiah. There's something to the way the words are beyond my grasp that makes them feel more real. In a similar fashion, when I hear Civ leaders say things in English, I find myself more drawn to scrutinize the voice. Civ 5 George Washington comes to mind.
The people of the United States of America welcome you.
I've even had friends disagree about him in all different directions. He sounds too much like Bill Clinton. Shouldn't he sound more British? What accent even is that? Actually, the Southern accent is the most Shakespearean in the US, and so on and so forth. When I've played Britain in AoE 3, or when I've encountered Elizabeth in Civ 5, my brain has a moment of, oh, right, I understand you upon hearing their voices. In an ironic way, that intelligibility gets in the way of immersion for me, even though a British accent, or an English one to be specific, does have quote-unquote foreign signal to it for an American. And that brings George back. When I hear him, I can't help wondering if he's supposed to sound more American for the sake of non-Americans. Much like Cleopatra in 6 and the choice they made for her, I wonder if he's meant to signal a culture more than be accurate. I wonder about the intent. And that wondering draws me into a deeper hole, that of language games. I'm not a linguist, but linguistics fascinate me from a philosophical perspective, so I am going to take this as an opportunity to talk about the use of language in games and something perhaps confusingly in this context called language games. The concept of language games was first articulated by Ludwig Wittgenstein in around 1953. To be clear and concise about it, the phrase can be broken down into two parts. Language, I think everyone gets. It's words spoken to communicate. But contextually, game here means like a rule or rule sets, not a card game or video game. So a language game is the implied context by which we understand a word, by which a word is given its meaning. Let's differentiate something here. A siege company captain saying fire and a villager fleeing immolation saying fire are using different words that appear the same, but we'd translate them differently, and the synonyms are not themselves synonymous. Launch and flames are not the same word. That isn't a language game. But if I exclaim fire because I've finally lit a torch, and because of a fire burning something down and I want to warn people, those are referring to the same thing with different intentions. In a silly way, the term language game itself is a language game. We have to understand the word game as rules. A game can be many things, physical, immaterial, psychological, all that, but by one definition, a game is its rules. Words change meaning based not on just the words around them, but on the context uttered in. In turn, we get to the point where language isn't absolute and has more to do with context and intent. Contextually, you aren't expected to understand Age of Mythology's ancient Egyptian. You aren't intended to use the words to play the game. The words do not function as words normally do. They don't mean anything anymore, but they create immersion. For another example of language used to create immersion in a time, one that goes beyond games, look at the modern use of ye, thee, and thou. Such words are used to elicit an archaic authority, often for medieval or older speech, harkening back to when English had a formal and informal form of you, like German or some forms of Spanish. But the thing is, the reason English dropped those parts of speech was for being too informal, not formal. So the use of it to sound fancy and archaic is incorrect to history, even if it signifies a dignified past to contemporary listeners. Immersion is a function of aesthetic that languages create in these games. The point of these languages is not to communicate anything, nor to even be correct to history. It is to express time and space, either as a place the player inhabits or a place from which a character originates. Being indulgent here, doesn't this contort the intent of language itself? The point, the magic of the Civ leaders in the Age of Mythology NPCs and their language is in not being understood. It's in imparting the wonder of a foreign culture, of an ancient people. You understand that you don't understand them, but context still makes the words mean something, not as words, but as history, as culture, as something you recognize anyway. I suppose part of my inspiration for this is looking back at something that inspired me to get into history and how it held flaws. The campaign I most remember, the Aztec one I started this whole video with, is flat out ahistorical for the sake of gameplay. They wanted the player to be able to play a cool new Aztec campaign, but they didn't want to end the campaign on a negative, so you win the Siege of Tenochtitlan, even though historically that was the end of the Aztec Empire. And that attitude to history as a device for telling an interesting story as a vehicle for gameplay is transferred onto language. There's a discussion to be had, I'm sure, about the use of languages and how one evokes them or makes them up, and if that's an act of odd disrespect or not. There's likely a question of how much due diligence there is to getting it right and all that, but I don't know where to place that bar, and I suspect it would be case by case. The answer to why couldn't they just get someone with voice acting talent and perfect ancient Greek pronunciation to do the lines for the villager NPCs is probably in the neighborhood of because that person wasn't reasonably accessible or they didn't care enough. Honestly, given the legacy of games before Age of Mythology often having untrained who's in the office today to pretend to be a Roman centurion vibes, Age of Mythology did great. Obviously, one isn't expected to understand every language in Age of Empires, in Civ, in Age of Mythology to play the games or to get the most out of their experience. In a sense, much like the educational elements, languages serve more towards immersion than actual learning, though you can certainly learn some things. But again, much like those educational elements, which vary in quality, don't go around saying you speak a bit of ancient Egyptian because you remember Age of Mythology barks. Let games like this be a site of curiosity, but never the end of your learning. Hi, thanks for listening as I indulged in a video I had on my mind for nearly a year at this point. Also, thanks to everyone who subscribed or did the things, and thanks to all the people I reached out to for a bit of insight on this one. All the links to their respective channels will be linked below. And thanks to the Patreon people who make it possible for me to afford food by doing this. In alphabetical order, as always, we have John Ursaw, Defender, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Lissing Afame, Mark Soto, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nitro Sweden, Sippo Turnipsy, and Queen Naked Mole Rat. I'm considering doing Patreon questions in future videos in this tail end section. That and being more consistent with little outro clip secret things. I don't know. We'll see. Bye.
アーカントス、なんとありがたい。アトランティスきっての提督が自ら駆けつけてくれるとは。